with groups kind of like this at Fayetteville State, UNC Pembroke, UNC Chapel Hill. Trying to think where else. I guess that covers it. I'm happy to add Methodist to my list here. It also is material that we share with all of our new teachers in the Cumberland County schools. Okay, so I apologize in advance if any of y'all go to work for Cumberland County schools, and it would be my hope that you all would. But for those of you who do, you will get another dose of this down the road, because we feel like this is really important material for all of our people to absorb and to be able to ask questions about and talk about. Along those lines, I really welcome, your comments, questions, interruptions, whatever along the way. Otherwise, it's just kind of me up here doing my thing. Just a little bit of background on me. I am the in-house lawyer for the Cumberland County Schools. I've been in that position for 4 years, and prior to that, I was an attorney in private practice, mainly representing school systems. There were 3, Hoke, Scotland, and Clinton City, that I represented full-time, and then I also would kind of spread out over the eastern third of North Carolina and go to Wilmington or Rocky Mount, different places where there might be, sort of specialized education law issues that I get called in on. So this is something I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about public education. My wife is a teacher. My daughter is a middle grades math teacher with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. And so, this is kind of, for our little family, this is sort of our family business, but I'm really pleased to be here and share some of this with you guys. All right.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
You being a lawyer, do you not have to hold a licensure?
I do not have an education license, but I certainly have a law license, which I hold near and dear to my heart. And one of the things we're going to talk about is the similarities between the licensure scheme for somebody like me or a nurse and you guys when you become fully licensed teachers. So I appreciate the question. All right, so we are going to touch on professional standards, social media, and what I call the duty to report. And again, I appreciate it. It's lunchtime. We're getting ready to crank up March Madness again this evening. People are looking ahead to the weekend, so I don't take your time and attention for granted. We are going to share some stories with you, unfortunately, about people in the teaching profession who kind of went off the rails. But the intent there is not to, frighten anybody or embarrass the teaching profession. It's really just to share with you all some cautionary tales, I guess you could call them, and the fact that, we're here having this conversation today. I want to emphasize to you again, going to the question about licensure, that it's really a special thing in our society to be a licensed professional person. I mean, in terms of, the educational standards and the personal conduct standards, a lot of those are the same across all these disciplines. And our state, our culture, I think rightly so, holds people who they trust in these professions to kind of a higher level of behavior and conduct, whether you're on the job or off the job. So we'll get into that. Okay, so as I said, we're going to talk about some essential professional standards that come to us from the state of North Carolina in terms of the State Board of Education, and also professional standards that you all will encounter in any public school system in North Carolina, and I feel certain that there are similar standards in charter schools and private schools around our state. We're going to spend right much time talking about social media use, because we find that that is a real hot spot as far as an area in personal life, professional life, where people in the teaching profession get in trouble, unfortunately. And we don't want that to ever happen to any of y'all or your colleagues. And then the third thing I mentioned, duty to report. This really has to do with school safety issues and student safety issues. And this can get into some pretty tough stuff, because when we're dealing with children, they bring their lives, their backgrounds, their traumas, all their challenges into the classroom with us. And many, many times it's that caring, observant classroom teacher who notices that something is really wrong here, and this child really needs help, outside of the school context. So we're gonna talk about some of those kinds of issues as well. All right, so essential professional standards. First one we want to talk about is this policy that comes to us from our North Carolina State Board of Education. It's got two parts: the Code of Ethics and the Standards of Professional Conduct. The Code of Ethics, and we're just kind of hitting the highlights here, the Code of Ethics emphasizes that the educator maintains an appropriate relationship with students in all settings, okay? That's not just on the job in the classroom, that's 24/7, at the movie theater, out in a restaurant, in a grocery store, on a field trip, wherever. Yes, ma'am, you had a question right there.
Is that why they are just not to necessarily hug students?
To not,
Hug students?
that's part of it. We'll touch on that. There's a state law in North Carolina that governs what we call physical restraint of students, and it talks about, in the course of you all doing your work and being in the classroom and looking after your kids, and I'm just simplifying here, generally it is okay to put your hands on a student if it's reasonably necessary to maintain order, to keep the child from hurting themselves or somebody else, to, heaven forbid, defend yourself if you had to, those kinds of things. And the law actually specifically says it's okay to comfort a child or to direct a child. And the example I give, especially with elementary ed people like you all, so many of you, is, the part in the law about directing children. The picture I have in my mind is the little munchkins who, they're not quite sure, how to get to the lunchroom, and you may have to kind of, direct them, drive them a little bit, to make sure the line goes the right way and they're not like lemmings going off a cliff. And the other thing about, and literally in the statute, the ability to comfort a child. If a child is upset, distraught, maybe self-injurious, something like that, it's okay to do that. Now, if it's hugging in order to encourage, solicit, or engage in a sexual or romantic relationship, that is an absolute no-no, okay? That's never appropriate. And this is our basic state law statement on all that. So, again, going back to this Code of Ethics, and we'll touch on the restraint and seclusion law later, but the basic idea here is we always got to remember who's the adult, who's the child, who's the teacher, who's the student. Can't ever cross that line of, getting involved in some sort of romantic, let alone sexual way with one of our students. It applies 24/7, 365 days a year. People who cross this line lose their license in North Carolina. They can also be prosecuted for really serious felonies, okay, because there's a state criminal law that bookends with this. Another big piece of the Code of Ethics is this idea that we respect our students' privacy. Who's heard of FERPA? Okay, anybody tell me what that acronym stands for?
I don't know what it stands for, but it's essentially like HIPAA, but in schools.
But for schools, for students, exactly. Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And that's a guarantee to students and their families that their confidential student information will remain confidential. We've got, you know, the EC community represented here. I mean, you can only imagine how important it is to maintain the confidentiality of the information you learn about your individual students, their disabilities, the supports they receive, you know, to work with their disabilities, all that kind of stuff. But you'd be amazed at how many situations arise, you know, not just across North Carolina, but throughout the country, where well-meaning educators, and this is not limited to classroom teachers, I mean, it can be principals, central office administrators, who will, just to be blunt, blab about students and their situations to other people, sometimes in very public settings. I mean, whether it's the, you know, the produce aisle at the food line, or, you know, somewhere else. And where this really gets bad is where people sometimes start, you know, venting about that kid in their class who gets on their nerves on social media. You can only imagine the kind of reaction that you could get from a kid's parents or grandparents or whoever if, you know, word gets back that, you know, his teacher is talking about, you know, his speech therapy on Facebook, you know. But, you know, believe it or not, people have crossed that line. And again, not just classroom teachers, but other people in the school system. Not our school system, but anyway. So let's always be respectful of confidential student information. Okay, the second part of this state board policy is what's called the standards of professional conduct. And there you have this key expectation that's underlined there, that all of you all as licensed educators in the state of North Carolina will serve as positive role models for students, parents, and the community. Now, going back to kind of our preliminary conversation, if you look at the licensing standards for attorneys, for law enforcement officers, nurses, doctors, you know, whoever we're talking about, dentists, dental hygienists, there'll be a very similar expectation. Again, the basic idea here is that as a state and a community, we entrust certain people with great responsibility. I mean, I would argue that you all have the greatest responsibility, or will have it, when you're fully practicing licensed teachers. But along with that responsibility is this expectation that, you know, you're going to conduct yourself in a way that tends to, let us say, instill confidence in what you're doing as an individual professional and in the profession as a whole. I mean, it's hard for society to function, for example, if doctors and nurses just routinely showed up, you know, stoned on the job or something like that. I mean, you know, we want people to have confidence in and take advantage of the skill and the knowledge of our medical professionals. Same thing with you guys as educators. But part of that is this notion that you're expected to be a positive role model. And again, this is one of those expectations. It's not just when you're on the job in the classroom, it's 24/7, 365 days a year. So that, you know, I'll give you an example of a teacher in North Carolina who ran afoul of this. There was a young man who was a teacher, had come back to his hometown here in North Carolina to teach school, and, you know, as young folks do, found his crowd to go out with on a Friday night, and they were down at the local tavern, and things got a little excited in there, and for some reason, maybe a lot of liquid courage or whatever, the teacher decided, well, I'm gonna settle, you know, whatever was going on in there around the pool table. Went back out to his truck, got a sawed-off shotgun, walked back into the bar, and leveled it on everybody, and said, you know, this is ended here. Everybody go home, bye bye bye. You know, and in his mind, I guess he was thinking he was, you know, doing a good thing to sort of restore order, but that was viewed as a violation of this expectation by the State Board of Education, and that person lost their teaching license. We don't want teachers going out and, you know, brandishing sawed-off shotguns in crowded bars. You know, that's not being a positive role model. Neither is, you know, hanging out with your good old disreputable friends from high school and then winding up in the, you know, police blotter down in Myrtle Beach because, you know, everybody got rolled up on some, you know, drug charge or something like that. So, you know, I know I'm preaching to the choir on a lot of this stuff, but the idea is what you do on your own time and who you do it with matters. If you get involved in criminal violations, criminal charges, that can affect your ability to maintain a teaching license and do your job. Okay, continuing with the standards of professional conduct, that first underlined sentence there is a really important one. It's a simple sentence, but it's got a lot of different meanings packed in there. I saw a hand somewhere out of the corner.
I have my hand raised.
Yes,
but
ma'am.
I think I answered my own question. With your example you gave of drinking and getting arrested. So if you were not in Cumberland County but worked for Cumberland County, like if you were on vacation and you got arrested,
Oh,
could you
yeah.
get your license for that?
Yeah.
Cause it's still,
Yeah. One of the saddest cases I was ever involved in, and this was before I came to work with Cumberland County, was involved a young teacher in a very hard to fill specialty area, had tremendous promise, tremendous skill, and you know, you hear that old cliche about hanging out with the wrong crowd. Well, this teacher was with three old friends down at Wrightsville Beach on a weekend, and you know, car got stopped for having a taillight out or something silly like that, and come to find out there's a bunch of cocaine in the car. And so, you know, what happens next? Well, everybody in the car gets charged with, you know, possession and intent to distribute, and it's just a bad scene. But, you know, that person was half a state away from where they were, but still, it was bad. So going back to this part of the policy here, this idea of treating all students with respect, I want to give you two possible ways to look at that. One is, and I think this is critically important, that when we talk about treating students with respect, to bring it down to the classroom level, the student code of conduct level, you know, student conduct level, all of those things, it means that we don't ever unnecessarily embarrass children. We don't humiliate children. We don't engage in, you know, practices that might provoke children, okay? I mean, y'all are gonna be leading elementary classrooms, not, you know, Marine Corps boot camp. So, you know, we don't ever want to, you know, back children into a corner, either literally or figuratively. This idea of not humiliating or embarrassing children. I mean, again, it comes down to, you know, dealing with that child that might get on your last nerve on a Friday afternoon and you feel like you've been putting up with all week long. Resist the temptation to call them out and just, you know, excoriate them in front of their peers. You know, try to handle discipline in a way that's still respectful of that child's privacy and kind of gives them an out and an opportunity to, you know, maybe admit that they were not doing the right thing. It also, this idea of treating all students with respect, it again ties into this non-negotiable expectation that we don't get involved romantically or sexually with our students, okay? If we respect our students, you know, we don't view them as potential dating partners or objects of, you know, some kind of awful exploitation or whatever. So, you know, there's a very simplistic kind of classroom idea of treating students with respect, but then there's also this overarching concern that we don't want any North Carolina licensed teachers to date any of our current students. Again, it's not just a licensure requirement and expectation, it's the criminal law. Serious Class C felonies down here, okay?
Is that a big issue in North Carolina?
It is unfortunately a big issue across the country and probably across the world. Because what we find is people who, for whatever reason, you know, have a psychological makeup or whatever it is that makes them more likely to prey on younger people as, you know, sexual objects. Those people will place themselves, they will find opportunities so that they'll be near children, okay, or young people, adolescents, whether it's in the teaching profession, maybe it's in the clergy, maybe it's as a church youth leader or a choir leader, maybe it's in scouting. You know, my son was an Eagle Scout, you know, unfortunately, you know, he woke up and, you know, saw the headline, you know, Boy Scouts declare bankruptcy because of all of the sex abuse claims against the Boy Scouts because of, you know, allegations against past scoutmasters or scout leaders or whatever. So I show all this stuff to you guys just to let you know, this is serious, this is something to keep in mind. It's something that well-meaning, you know, younger teachers have lost sight of. You know, if they're teaching high school students, it's like the teacher's, you know, 22 years old, a high school senior might be 19 years old. You can't date your students. But in terms of, you know, is it more prevalent in North Carolina or where? No, this is just a societal issue. I mean, I give the state of North Carolina and the State Board of Education a lot of credit for, I think, really being upfront, transparent about this, you know, recognizing that, you know, hey, this is an issue, but it's one that we are absolutely determined to do everything that we can to prevent from happening.
When it comes to reporting, this is something that a teacher is required to report as well, right?
Bingo.
This is
Yep,
sexual abuse.
we're gonna get to that.
Sorry.
Absolutely, no, you're fine. No, I appreciate the foreshadowing. No, that is absolutely a duty to report if, you know, a fellow teacher has a good faith belief that a colleague is violating any of this, okay? And again, the idea is, you know, I don't want y'all to walk out of here and be paranoid as like, you know, every third person in the schoolhouse is some kind of, you know, predator or something. That's not the case. But we want to make sure y'all understand it is serious business, and we don't ever want to be complacent about it. Because a very common denominator in the cases where bad things happen is that the good people kind of become complacent to what they see, what they observe, what they hear, you know, about a colleague, and then pretty soon, you know, something bad has happened. Okay, so those were the State Board of Education expectations. Let's talk about local school board expectations for teachers. And what I reference here is a policy that we have on the books in Cumberland County, and as far as I know, pretty much all 115 public school systems have on the books here in our state. It's a policy provided to us by the School Boards Association. They actually create model school board policies for all of the local boards of education. And this basic policy called staff responsibilities is one that applies to everybody who works for the school system, not just classroom teachers, but me, the custodians, bus drivers, child nutrition, all of us. And the first thing it says is we're all expected to be familiar with and abide by the other policies. So it's kind of like that old idea of ignorance of the law is no excuse. you're expected to know what your local policies are. But beyond that, we want everybody, including our classroom teachers, to attend to the safety and welfare of students. Okay? That really is job one, every single day. When those kids come to school, when they're dropped off or they step off the bus and they're in our classroom, they're in our building, in our care, job one is to make sure that those little people get delivered back to their parents or guardians or grandparents or whatever, safe and sound at the end of the day. We're all responsible for that. Second bullet, as school people, we tell the truth, okay? We're committed to the truth in all different situations. We demonstrate integrity and respect, and we tell the truth. Last bullet here is we support and encourage good school-community relations in all interactions, students, parents, whoever. In other words, we're good ambassadors for our school and for our school system. And it ties right back into that state board expectation that, you know, as school teachers, you all are held up as role models for your community. So this is just extending that expectation, not just to our licensed teaching corps, but to all the folks who work for the school system. So that's your, in a nutshell, those are your basic professional expectations from the State Board of Education that issues your teaching licenses down to the individual boards of education that will employ you if you go to work for a public system here in North Carolina. Any other questions, thoughts about that before we transition to social media? Okay.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Could you remind me what the E in FERPA stands for?
Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act.
Okay, thank you.
And just as an aside, you know, one of the core tenets of that is this idea that student information regarding, you know, student achievement, grades, work product, disabilities, all of that should remain strictly confidential unless the parent specifically, you know, signs something and says, you know, somebody else can see it. I say confidential, I mean people in the school, obviously, that have access to
But
it.
they need to know.
Exactly, need to know. Another part of it is this notion that parents have the right to see their children's records, okay? You know, it's not like we're keeping that data to ourselves. No, you know, the parents have a right to see it. And the other part of that is if a parent happens to see something in a record or a database or something that they think is just wrong, they can always raise their hand and question that and, you know, correct something that's wrong about a grade or, you know, whatever else it might be. Okay, so let's talk about social media for a while. We'll begin with the story of the happy traveler, somebody who, you know, walked the same path as many of you in a ed program. This is Ashley Payne. She actually grew up in Georgia, and she went to school for secondary ed and was a very successful and well-liked high school English teacher in a smallish town in eastern Georgia. Whoa. So that picture that you saw a moment ago, that was one of many that Ashley and her teacher friends posted on Facebook in the course of and after this big European vacation that they took one summer after school was out. And I'm not sure about the friends, but certainly for Ashley, it seemed that a big theme of the photographs was the amount of alcohol that was consumed at any given time. And this is kind of her with the two-fisted thing going. So she put all those pictures on Facebook, And she also did a lot of posting about something called Crazy Bitch Bingo in Atlanta that she and her friends frequented on Friday nights. And those pictures also apparently had a lot of depictions of, let us say, very generous alcohol consumption. And, you know, again, this was just all out in public on Facebook. She was working in a town of about 7,000 people surrounded by rural Georgia. You can imagine, wouldn't take too long for all that to become the talk of the town. Well, wanna go ahead? Anyway, to finish off Ashley's story, she was ultimately recommended for dismissal under a variety of grounds, including violations of a Georgia State Board of Education policy, very similar to what we've already seen here. You know, are you a good role model? You know, are you a good ambassador for your school system? And it really came down to that local school board thinking this person doesn't have a chance to be a successful classroom teacher in our high school anymore, because all of her prospective students and parents have seen her engage in all of this foolish behavior. You know, it's hard to be taken seriously as a professional and not have to constantly deal with, you know, snickers and catcalls and insults and, you know, other social media posts, whatever, if you just kind of aired all your dirty laundry out there on social media. So she was ultimately discharged from her teaching position, appealed it all the way up through the Georgia courts, but was ultimately unsuccessful. So just, you know, as I said before, a cautionary tale about someone, I'm sure, just a lovely person who, again, you know, the people who fired her said it's not about whether or not she can teach. I mean, she's a great teacher, you know, her kids' scores are great, you know, everything's, but, you know, this kind of behavior just makes it impossible for her to function successfully, because it was just a lot more over the top in a number of the photographs, even than the one that I showed. So that's a cautionary tale from not too far away from us in Georgia. This is another one. You know, this is not the kind of thing that's helpful for you in your career or your ability to be a, you know, successful teacher on a given day if you post this kind of stuff. I guess that was on Twitter. I also want to mention the thing about 19 more days. Sometimes you see or you hear about teachers, you know, posting things, you know, counting down, can't wait to, you know, be done with this year with these kids and stuff like that. Parents and grandparents don't appreciate that kind of stuff. And rest assured, they're gonna find out about it. They're gonna see it. You know, somebody, if it's on your public site, and even if you think it's on, you know, the personal part of your site, folks are gonna see it, and they're gonna tell somebody about it. Can you believe what Johnny's teacher did or Susie's teacher did or whatever else? So don't talk about stabbing kids. Don't count down, you know, the number of days, hours, and minutes until you're done with these, you know, awful kids forever and you don't ever want to see them again. Just, it's not helpful. Here's another example, you know, again, why do this? I mean, it's just, you know.
So many of these should have just been like a text message to your close friends that you're frustrated and not anywhere public.
Well, society today.
I would even be careful with the texting part myself, because you never know. You never know.
No, I know. I'm just
You know,
like,
yeah.
why anyone thought publicly putting that?
But you know, these are highly intelligent people, very experienced educators in most cases, and yet they've done stuff like this. I'll also tell you guys, just on the question about texts, for those of you all in particular who are going into EC, I mean, this is something that we see every day where not every day, but frequently, where there's some sort of dispute over special education services. You know, we know that's inevitable. I mean, you have high needs kids, you have parents who are passionate about their children, they want the best for them. Inevitably, there are what we call due process cases over EC services. And that's true in any school system, public or private. And what we find nowadays is that the parents who represent the parents and the kids, when they file those kinds of cases, they'll ask for everything, including the emails in and around the school that have to do with that kid, or even the text messages that teachers and staff members may send in the course of the workday regarding that student. Whether or not it's on a personal device, and 99% of the time it would be, on your cell phone. But just, something to keep in mind. Again, we're not trying to be paranoid here, but I'm just sharing with you, this is the real world that we're living in. Okay, so going back to the North Carolina State Board of Education, part of, unfortunately, what they have to do is to consider cases where, teachers have misbehaved, so to speak, and consider whether or not there should be, a revocation of their teaching license. So here's some data on actual license revocation cases from 2012 up to the present, which I guess is 10 years. And what we see there is, let's see, 13 cases involving text messaging. Most of those, I will tell you, are, where the teacher is texting inappropriately with the student. It's not, the situation you described. Twitter, you see there, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, but clearly, the stuff that people are putting out, electronically is coming back to haunt them on their licensure. Here's some other numbers that kind of break down the types of communications. Inappropriate communications with a student, where it says a denial, that was somebody who'd already lost their license and was trying to get it back. Then you see 2 reprimands, using the computer to facilitate a child sex crime. You would think, yeah, that's definitely a license revocation. Inappropriate communications with students. A voluntary surrender is where the teacher just gives up. They say, hey, take the license, I'm not even gonna fight it. Other inappropriate text messages, 1 revocation. And going back to your comment about the duty to report inappropriate behavior by a colleague, there's a suspension for a year for failure to report inappropriate behavior of a colleague directed towards a student.
That's
So,
what it seemed like in that to me.
well, every case is fact specific, and we don't, because these are confidential, we're not privy to, the underlying facts in these cases. Yes, sir.
Whenever a teacher voluntarily gives up their license, are they able to go back and get it again, or is it?
The lawyer's favorite answer is, it depends. It may be possible, yeah, it may be possible. Again, given the facts, I mean, if it was somebody who, committed some sex offense with a student, they're not ever gonna get it back. But if it was something else, maybe if it was just stupid stuff, maybe kind of the Ashley Payne, I went off on a 2-week drunk holiday with my friends and, had my license suspended for a year or something, then that would be different. Yeah.
So I'm assuming there has to be proof that, I knew something bad was going on and I didn't report it. Because what if I was just that teacher's neighbor or in the hallway neighbor, and they're like, you knew, I'm like, I know, I legit didn't know.
Yeah.
I
No,
wouldn't
they're,
for that.
yeah. I mean, the standard of proof in these state board things is the preponderance of the evidence. And, that's the same standard of evidence is in a civil trial, the greater weight of the credible evidence. So yeah, it would have to be, you know, maybe an email, you know, that somebody says like, I can't believe that so-and-so keeps doing X, Y, Z with this student, you know? And, you know, I'm just imagining, but it would have to be something pretty definite. Here are some actual license revocation cases that the state board has provided some details on, just kind of as a teaching tool. So we had a female student who gathered information using a fake Facebook account. It turned out that this particular teacher already had one written reprimand for commenting on students' Instagram postings, and then a year later sent sexual images on Snapchat to a female student, and then when confronted with that behavior, admitted sending a picture of his private parts to someone who turned out to be a student, and no surprise, that person lost their license.
They will receive some kind of criminal.
There could well be, yeah, again, you know, it depends on the facts of the case, but,
I'm asking specifically about sending the image of your, I know somebody in the army who did exactly that, and is on trial for it, that's why I'm asking. And it's in
Yeah.
Florida though, that's why I was asking, so is it like something that's illegal across
That-
the
that
board,
could
or is
be-
it just for violating the code of ethics?
that could be, this thing, this sending this, you know, obscene picture could be some sort of solicitation to commit, you know, a sex offense.
That's where I was.
Yeah,
probably
so
just-
that easily could be something that would be prosecuted.
What if someone's like wrongfully accused of doing something, and then they find out that it's not true, but it's already too late? What happens then?
Well, I will tell you, having been in this business for almost 30 years and having dealt with a lot of personnel cases, you know, basically from here to the North Carolina coast, those situations that, you know, I think could naturally worry us seem to be very rare. I mean, that's been my experience. That the false accusation scenario is very, very rare. I'm not saying that it doesn't ever happen, but it seems to be very rare. And if that ever occurs, I mean, there's tremendous due process built into all of this. I mean, it's not just some scenario where, you know, the trembling teacher is called into the court of the Star Chamber up there in Raleigh, and they say, well, we know you did this, what do you have to say? No, I mean, it's, you know, intense fact discovery, just like in a lawsuit, there are lawyers involved, you get all the facts out on the table. Everybody involved in the process, you know, is sworn to tell the truth under penalty of perjury and, you know, maybe loss of their licenses or whatever. So, again, I'm not discounting that altogether, but I want to assure you, in my experience, that is exceedingly rare, and there are tremendous due process protections built in. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned lawyers and everything. Is there like a group of people who investigates these things? Because they're not crimes, so it wouldn't be, or, well, they are, but in this general sense, we're not talking about the crime aspect, just the ethics aspect. So is there like a ethics group that investigates all of this?
Yes, yeah, there's a licensure, I forget the exact name, licensure committee of the State Board of Education. There are also professional legal staff, lawyers and paralegals on staff at the State Board of Education and Department of Public Instruction that this is what they do. You know, they get complaints in about teachers or administrators. Most of the information that they receive is generated by a local school system, you know, who's already determined that this teacher did something bad and maybe, you know, fired them or something like that. And in that case, the school system's legally obligated to to share that information at the state level. Then once they receive it, then they do their own investigation and they got their whole own due process piece. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, here's another real life example from the state board. High school English teacher unintentionally videoed himself in the nude and then posted that on Twitter. Again, it's kind of the Ashley Payne idea. You know, once all your students have seen you in your birthday suit, you know, all your parents, all that, you know, it's kind of difficult to imagine yourself being a real successful, effective teacher. This person had already received a written warning about friending parents and students on social media. The only surprising thing about this one is that their license was just suspended for 2 years. I mean, I would have bet money going in that this person would
Do
have
we
had
have
their
a
license revoked.
policy on the whole parents and being friends with them on social media?
Next subject we're gonna get to. Good question. Here's one more. I think this teacher linked, let's see, used by, okay, oh, he had connected his personal accounts to the school iPad. Another teacher was using the iPad for testing or something and saw all this completely inappropriate subject matter. Looks like this teacher may have also had a substance abuse issue. This person lost their license. So what we see in these cases over and over again, the most common pitfalls for teachers in these licensure cases, at least regarding social media, are inappropriate communication with students. You know, hey, would you like to go to the movies on Friday night? Inappropriate communications about students. Wow, can you believe that Johnny is as dumb as a rock, and that's the way all 3 generations of his family, you know, my mother told me when she was teaching that all these people were stupid, you know, that kind of stuff. Believe it or not, I mean, it's happened. Just blatantly offensive subject matter, whatever it is. You know, unfortunately, you see situations where people talk about all kinds of completely crazy topics like, you know, cannibalism and everything else you can imagine. And then the famous recurring way to kind of limit your career in any chosen profession is to complain publicly about your employer. So, and on that point, I want to emphasize to you, you know, as school teachers, particularly as public school teachers, you don't give up your First Amendment rights. If you want to write a letter to the Federal Observer and say, you know, for example, I think that the calendar adopted by the Cumberland County Board of Education is not a good idea because of X, Y, and Z. Well, you know, the school calendar is a matter of public debate. You know, it's discussed and reviewed in public by the Board of Education. They vote on it and adopt it. It affects close to 50,000 kids every year. That's a matter of public concern, okay? Same thing with, you know, the idea of something like, I think that it would be a great idea for the Cumberland County schools to expand middle school sports to include, you know, some additional sports or whatever. You know, that's a matter of public concern. But if you wrote a letter to the editor that said, my principal is an idiot and doesn't know what to, you know, because of all, now that's what we would loosely call in the school law profession work speech, okay? Purely work speech, internal nuts and bolts, how things function in your school. You don't ever want to air that dirty laundry in public, whether it's on social media or through traditional media or showing up at the school board meeting to make a public comment. There are ways for you to deal with internal matters. You know, we have grievance policies, complaint policies, anonymous reporting. There's all, you know, if one of our folks feels like something wrong is going on in the Cumberland County School, we got lots of ways to get that word out and for your voice to be heard internally. But you just don't want to air that linen in public. You know, on the other hand, you know, you want to write a letter to the editor about, you know, which political candidate you favor, you know, which political party you're a member of, whatever. That's all fine. Those are matters of public debate, of public interest. But if you start talking publicly about the private areas of your job, that's a problem. Does that distinction sort of make sense to you all? Okay. All right, so let's talk about school board policy on social media. And we're gonna get to your question about friending students and all that stuff. Got a series of slides here that review this policy, 7335, employee use of social media. As far as I know, all 115 public school systems in North Carolina have adopted some version of this policy. It's written by the School Boards Association. It's really, as I point out there, it's a logical extension of what we've already seen from our essential professional standards from the state and from our local boards. I certainly don't want to give you all the impression that, you know, we have some sort of social media police, okay? I mean, it's not like we got, you know, a bunch of people in an airtight, you know, windowless room somewhere here in Fayetteville monitoring all of our employees, you know, social media accounts. Couldn't be further from the truth. However, if one of our employees does something on their own time with their own personal social media that causes an issue, and we get a call from a parent or a grandparent or a school board member or whoever it is that, you know, hey, I think you might want to look at what, you know, so-and-so put on their Facebook, then it becomes our issue and we're going to look at it through this lens. But it's only if there's a problem. I mean, we're looking to our people to police themselves. And that's why we talk about this policy all the time. For all of our new employees, whether they're teachers or custodians or paralegals or whoever, you know, they all have to review and sign off on this. And every summer before we start each school year, there's a number of policies we make everybody review again, and this is one of them. So we're constantly trying to remind folks about this because we don't want to have any issues. You know, we want to keep and retain good people and for people to have happy, successful careers. But as I say, it applies to all our staff members and it applies 24/7. It's like those state board policies, code of ethics, standards of professional conduct. And, you know, we recognize, I mean, we live in a social media age. People are on it all the time. It's kind of like, you know, folks' alter ego. But folks need to be mindful that they're responsible for their social media presence outside of what they might be doing with social media as part of their teaching work. And again, you know, first bullet, that's a recurring theme here, maintain professional relationships with students at all times. And then we have some general rules, okay? Generally speaking, all electronic communications with students must be school related. That's the general rule. And school personnel may only use school controlled technology and social media tools to communicate directly with students. Now, are there exceptions to that? Absolutely. Do we have teachers who have kids in the system? Absolutely. Is it okay for them to communicate with their own kids, you know, through social media? Sure. Do we have teachers who are church youth leaders, scout leaders, whatever? You know, there may be a Facebook page for a Boy Scout troop, you know, whatever it is, 723 at Snyder Memorial Baptist Church. Sure. You know, if you're a teacher and you're involved in communicating with kids through something like that, just let your principal know. You know, let somebody know, this is what I do. You know, this is another part of my life. We don't have all the verbiage here, but the policy allows for those kinds of exceptions. You know, again, with your own children, with children that you have some relationship with outside of school. Maybe you're an AAU basketball coach, you know, and your team has a web page or something. I mean, you know, just let somebody know up front. Don't let somebody be surprised by that. Another recurring theme, we keep students' business private, okay? And we don't friend students.
What about their parents though?
But that's one of those exceptions. If it's, you know, a parent-child relationship, or, you know, maybe it's one of these other connections I've just referred to. You know, maybe there's some, you know, outside sports team, club, religious affiliation, something like that. But there's a mechanism under this policy for you to let folks know up front, hey, that's what I'm doing. You know, you share it with an assistant principal.
My kid's school is a very close-knit, small community, so.
Do what?
I said my kid's school
Uh-huh.
is a very close-knit.
But she was asking, she is actually friends
Yeah, I'm friends with some of the
with one of the
teachers.
teachers that has,
Oh.
so she's, I think.
I'm
what
just
she was
curious, cause I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that like a lot of them are friends with like parents on social media.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if it's a, you know, a social connection outside of school, or if it's a connection through students, that's okay. You know, if my child and your child are best friends and we're teachers in the same school or what, you know, just again, the idea is let somebody know, you know.
Keep it professional.
Yeah, just keep it professional, let somebody know.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when, like, I have an example, like, is that when a teacher's, like, when you, like, that specific teacher is your teacher at that point where you can't have that? Cause after that, like, it's okay, right? The teacher can, years later, following you on Facebook, that your teacher was in, like, second grade, that would be okay for
Maybe
them.
not principal, just
If-
teacher.
Cause like, that's,
I would say like years later, like when that young person is no longer a student in that school system, it would be
Alright.
okay.
even,
But if you're their sixth grade teacher and now they're in the eighth grade or the 10th grade, I wouldn't be friending them or communicating to them through social media.
Unless maybe if you had like a teacher Twitter that you posted like educational stuff, that would be okay, more so.
Absolutely, you know, that could be a very allowable exception. Again, just the idea is full disclosure to the folks you work for, you know, to make sure they're aware of what you're doing and they don't have any issue with it. But yeah, if it's some sort of educational feed, I mean, you know, my kids get after me because I'm on Twitter, you know, they think I'm gonna do something crazy with it. And I tell them, you know, I'm following, you know, like this day in history and stuff. I mean, that's my Twitter experience, you know, just because that's how I can, you know, learn little factoids in my spare moments. So yeah, I mean, that can be allowable under the right circumstances. Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if we could step away from social media for just a second and
Sure.
discuss their responsibility regarding things in the classroom. And I'll share, some of them may have heard my experience. I have a daughter that was in, I don't know if she had an IEP or something, but she was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, she was character. I'm not gonna stick up for her. But it came down to about 3 weeks, maybe a month before graduation. And they said they were not gonna let her graduate because of something. And so, what happened was that she had the IEP, but the teacher did not enforce it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I called the principal, who I knew, of course, and the guidance counselor, and I said, I want a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I'm not gonna sue you, but I want you to know that I think she's left the school system open. Not only E.E. Smith, but Cumberland County schools as a whole, open to a lawsuit because she did not do her legal responsibility.
It was a
to
failure
uphold-
to implement the
Yes, as a
IEP.
failure
Mhm.
to implement it, and we went to the meeting, and I told him ahead of time, I said, don't worry, I'm not gonna do anything
Mhm.
legally,
Mm-hmm.
but I want her to understand, and I want you guys to understand that if your child or you have a student with an IEP, you are legally responsible to do what's in that IEP and to have proof that you did it. Because when we were in that conference, and I said, well, I wanna see where you did this, And they sent her to get her lesson plans and stuff, and she had no documentation.
Mhm.
She could not prove that she had supported the IEP.
Well, I hate that you had that experience, but, you know, that is the kind of thing in the EC world, you know. If y'all aren't sick of me, maybe sometime we can come back and we'll talk about IDEA and EC specifically, but that failure to implement the IEP itself, I mean, that's such a common fact pattern,
Right.
unfortunately, in that whole area. And you're right, I mean, as we're talking about legal obligations, you know, for those of y'all who have, EC students with IEPs, you're exactly right. I mean, that's a legal requirement. In fact, that's a federal legal requirement to implement that IEP.
Well, I think I scared her to death, if nothing else.
Well, it just, yeah, I mean, that, unfortunately, those kinds of experiences are as old as that law
Yeah.
itself.
But I really just want them to be aware of that, you know, that you have a legal responsibility there too.
Absolutely,
to do what is.
absolutely. Anything else here before I move on? I'll move on. So, again, this is all just verbiage from that, social media policy. Again, I think this is, you know, should be sinking in if it's not just completely repetitive now from some material we've already covered. One insight here, that second bullet, don't give students access to any part of your social networking sites that the general public can't see. I mean, allowing kids into the private portion of your social media landscape, that's a big no-no. Then we talk here about being professional and internet postings related to the school system. Don't use profane, pornographic, obscene, indecent, lewd, vulgar, or sexually offensive language. That seems pretty self-explanatory. And again, this idea, you know, I've mentioned before, you know, just don't do stuff that makes it impossible for you to be a credible instructional leader there in your classroom. That's what they're talking about when they say don't post inappropriate content, excuse me, that negatively impacts your ability to perform your job. All right, that's kind of the overview of social media obligations and potential pitfalls. Let's spend the rest of our time here talking about the duty to report. And this covers a variety of areas we mentioned there: school safety, child welfare, and then, you know, what we've talked about from the beginning, the possibility that a staff member crosses the line with a student. So, again, NCSBA, that's North Carolina School Boards Association, they have a basic policy on school safety. It covers all kinds of stuff having to do with, you know, how to keep our schools safe. But one of the most important aspects of it is this idea, this obligation that all staff members have to report immediately any unusual or suspicious behavior or acts of violence, harassment, or bullying. So what does that mean in the real world? Well, aside from this policy, we got a lot of other policies and laws that tell us that we don't tolerate harassing or bullying behavior, whether on the basis of sex or some other basis, in any context, okay? We are not down with harassment and bullying. If it's occurring in our school, we wanna know about it. And if you're working in our school, we expect you to let us know. If you see, you know, several kids harassing or bullying another, or, you know, it could be staff members picking on each other, whatever it is, we wanna hear about it. Certainly an act of violence, whatever that could be, you know, one kid beating up another, or a staff member, you know, putting hands inappropriately on a kid, we wanna know about it. But then we also wanna know that this other piece, this unusual or suspicious behavior, that's a kind of a more general requirement. And that's unfortunately, excuse me, an expectation that I think has grown from the time of 9/11 through some of these, you know, school shooting cases, which, you know, we can't ignore as responsible school people. So, for example, I was working with a rural, North Carolina school system one time where there was a registered sex offender who lived like 2 miles from this rural elementary school. And a sharp-eyed, observant, elementary teacher noticed that when she took her kids out for recess, at pretty much, I guess, the same time every day, just kind of out there in the woods beyond the fence line, there was this kind of creepy looking person. Excuse me. And she reported it, and, law enforcement investigated, and come to find out, this person had all kinds of crazy, telescopic lenses
Oh
and,
my god.
was spying on the kids and everything else. But that's a perfect example of what this policy is expected to do. Same thing if, say, you're working the car line one day and you open the door to, let a kid get in their parent's car, and you happen to notice, an AR-15 in plain view. We have laws that say you're not supposed to bring firearms on school property. That's something you should report. Not to get into the Second Amendment or anything else, but we do have that law that says you're not supposed to bring a firearm on public school property unless you're a law enforcement officer or, there's some emergency reason for doing so. So we want to know about those kinds of things. Bottom line is, if you see something, say something. We all have a shared responsibility for keeping our schools safe. Did you have a question? Okay, this is another very important reporting requirement, and this is one, actually, if you step back and look at the North Carolina General Statutes under child welfare, this is actually a reporting requirement that falls on every adult North Carolinian, okay? So if you're a resident of the state, and you're 18 or over, and you, pull up in the Walmart parking lot and you happen to see some parent just, physically abusing a child, you as a citizen of North Carolina have a duty to report that to social services or law enforcement. This is a comparable expectation that we make very clear on all of our school employees, bus drivers, custodians, teachers. Any school employee who knows or has cause to suspect child abuse, neglect, or dependency shall immediately report that to the principal. And if you have any doubt, if it's something you're thinking, well, was that really what I thought I saw or whatever? The policy says report it anyway. Don't keep it to yourself. I think all of us probably have some kind of walking around idea of what child abuse is. Neglect means failure to provide for the basic needs, welfare, safety of a child. Dependency is a little bit more elusive. What that means is when there's no adult, no responsible adult who's there to care for the child. The classic case of the child who's living from pillar to post. We have tragic situations that happen with some frequency where there's a single parent and the parent dies. And there's not anybody there to really pick up the pieces for this child. The closest relatives may be in Ohio or something. And I actually, I worked with one of our elementary schools not long ago on that very kind of scenario. I got a call from a school social worker saying, hey, somebody brought the newspaper to me and showed us obituary, and then we started finding, call social services. Because we want to make sure that there's a responsible adult, even if it's a foster parent, whoever. We want somebody who can look after that youngin'. And a dependent child is one who's, doesn't have that adult. Another way you hear that described sometimes as the unaccompanied minor. And that gets really scary in a transient community like ours, sitting here on I-95, where, unfortunately, we have a lot of sex trafficking issues in this area, and we have unaccompanied adolescents. You'll see them out on Eastern Boulevard, near I-95, those places. if those kids happen to show up in our school system, they may well be dependent, and we need to report them to social services. In addition to social services, there are also some situations where we're required to report child welfare issues to law enforcement. And in the public school context, when we talk about law enforcement, most of the time we're thinking of our SRO, our school resource officer, who may be assigned full-time to our school, or if it's a smaller elementary school, they may rotate, between 2 or 3 during the day. But like in our big comprehensive high schools, we may have 3 school resource officers on the premises at any given time. So, we frequently go to those SROs, those resource officers, in these kinds of situations where school employees have a good faith reason to believe that there's been a sexual offense committed against a juvenile. And this is another one of those 24/7 whatever things. If one of your children comes back after Thanksgiving break and says, you ask them, what's wrong? You don't seem like yourself. Well, something bad happened over the holiday. Well, what was that? Well, my uncle did something bad to me. What, and you see those kinds of disclosures from time to time by children. Those are things, if they come to your attention, you want to make sure that somebody in your chain of command, somebody in your school knows that it's serious business and that we need to report it to law enforcement, usually that SRO. Same thing if one of your kids gets hurt, if a kid gets jumped over the weekend and shows up with, terrible bruises, maybe a gash where they got cut or something like that, let the SRO know. And then obviously, I just touched on the whole human trafficking thing. That's something I think as a society we're taking more seriously, and I'm glad to see it. Obviously, if you ever had suspicions about that, you want to talk to school social worker, counselor, assistant principal, somebody who could get that word to law enforcement for you. But y'all would be amazed because as part of my life in private practice, when I was also representing school systems, I also did a lot of work for the Hope County Department of Social Services, mainly in really bad child abuse or neglect cases where we were actually terminating, parental rights. And you would just be amazed at how many of those cases where children were truly saved from awful circumstances, awful situations. It was the case of that observant, caring classroom teacher who knew that something was not right about a child. The way they acted, what they said, the discipline issues that seemed to come out of nowhere, and then there are obvious signs of, dirty, ragged clothing, they're hungry, all those things. But so many times, the children that I saw who were saved from the most awful circumstances, it started with a classroom teacher. So.
And so that just goes to show that teachers wear a lot of hats. What do you think? Just listening to you today, we've got a lot of hats that we wear.
Absolutely. I mean, in my mind and in my experience is that particularly in public schools, that classroom teacher, and I think particularly at the elementary level, y'all have the clearest lens into all of our, societal challenges, ills, whatever. I mean, my wife teaches kindergarten, and that's what she tells me almost every day, is I can't believe, I rode a bus home today, rode a bus to see where my kids went, and I mean, she sees it all. She knows it all. By the time she's been around those kids for a while, I mean, she knows the ones that the parents or grandparents really care about, and they're really there to support. And then she pretty quickly knows, where there are bad situations. And, one thing I I'm real proud of Cumberland County Schools is I think, in situations where kids have serious challenges at home, I mean, it might be food insecurity, it might be just other aspects of poverty, lack of health care, whatever it is, we have the most fantastic school social workers. And I'm just giving a plug to our head school social worker, Pamela Story, who is the United States National
We know.
School Social Worker of the Year. I mean, she's the tops. But we can't do anything, all those good people, they can't do anything unless they hear about it from you guys. Staff-student relations, we touched on that, that's your failure to report piece. Says here, you know, one possible consequence would be you just get fired if you don't report that inappropriate relationship. And I know your time is up, but so is the fireable.
Listen, we really appreciate your coming today, because there are things that I look at that I'm talking about that I didn't know, yeah. Some of these folks have another class they need to get to,
Sure,
but if
sure.
you have questions, I'm sure they're gonna